we are very busy doing the work, we don't take a step back to reflect and really build and document what our experiences have been. And as we reflect, then we're able to surface these issues that could be useful for Sudan and other countries, ourselves as well, because the work continues. So great appreciation to you, Wayamo. And thank you so much for the eminent speakers before me, Justice Lenaola, who I must say is a member of an esteemed association that we also are in together, the International Commission of Jurists, and has stood for this issue for a long time. Sarah, who we come a long way working on these issues as well. And I look forward to also listening to Adejoké later. So without too much, I think it's a very interesting moment in terms of discussions around justice in the globe. We have always understood that domestic justice is critical, but it seems like the shifts affirm just how much critical it is to invest in domestic processes. Increasingly, it seems like in the global space, there is less room for consideration of the other and more inward-looking politics amongst different countries. So with this shift in geopolitics, I think even more impetus for us to strengthen domestic systems and think about how we build sustainability for the long term. But also, as we think about South Sudan, is also the reality that as much as we look domestically, there's a lot to do with external geopolitics. And wearing the hat of South Sudan, for instance, the effect of what's going on in South Sudan, in South Sudan, many of you may have heard a couple of weeks ago because of attacks against South Sudanese within the conflict in Sudan, there was a flare-up of violence in South Sudan. We know that we have some visitors behind us here, nearby, from Sudan, in Kenya. We know that within the region, there are enablers, there are direct perpetrators. So domestic does not preclude external. As much as we strengthen the internal, we must also be looking at ourselves as a closer, neat interconnection of different states who must also care about the internal. So as we share these experiences and reflect, I think it's important to pay attention to that. So very quickly, maybe I wear two hats today, South Sudan and Kenya. And I think they both bring out very interesting lessons and experiences to reflect on. You're all familiar, South Sudan got independence 2011, breakout of conflict since 2013, signed a peace agreement, the first one in 2015, revitalized in 2018, and since then, they have been at work trying to implement the various elements of this peace agreement, which include numerous state and nation-building elements, but also transitional justice and accountability. Within this framework, the United Nations set up the Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, quite similar to the fact-finding mission that Justice Chande spoke about earlier, but with a bit of variances. So the commission that I work with has three overall mandates. First is to monitor and document the human rights situation in South Sudan, including collecting and preserving evidence of violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law. Secondly, it's mandated to provide guidance to the state on pursuing transitional justice mechanisms. And these are three in particular. The peace agreement anticipates the establishment of a truth commission, a reparation authority, and a hybrid court for South Sudan. And here is where progression in the region becomes quite interesting, because in South Sudan's peace agreement, they require the African Union to establish the hybrid court for South Sudan. Now, since the revitalized agreement in 2018, that has not seen the light of day, but as of last year, November, the president has signed into law two legislation to set up the Truth Commission and the Reparation Authority. So there's some progress, but we're not yet at criminal accountability. Suffice to say that whereas the direct combat between government and opposition forces has minimized, the conflict continues across the entire country at the subnational conflict. A lot of defections, fragmentation of factions, proliferation of arms, killings, and forced disappearance, displacement, conflict-related sexual violence continues in South Sudan. Our work, together with others who are collecting and documenting, is to prepare this evidence with the hope that we can eventually pass on this documentation to accountability mechanisms. And in fact, the mandate given by the Human Rights Council requires us, when the transitional justice mechanisms are set up credibly, to hand over the evidence that we're collecting today for accountability. And drawing on similarities with Sudan, I see the fact-finding mission as an extremely critical and instrumental body, layered with all of the caveats that Justice Chande spoke about earlier, collaboration with different actors, and so on. Now, coming back home, and I thank Justice Lenaola for laying that really excellent background on our history as a country. I think what's critical as in terms of offering practical illustrations of some of the issues that he, in fact, has already highlighted. And I'd like to give 4 key recommendations, I would say. And overarching all of these recommendations is this consideration of time, opportunity, and what happens in between. Inevitably, all over the world, whether it's from the Serbians, from Latin America, Africa, time. Accountability takes time. Because we're countering, we're resisting the trajectory that seeks to use violent means to resolving historical contestation against affirming the rule of law as the mode of resolving disputes. And that will continue to happen world over. So there is no point in time when we will say we have walked out of this space and we're walking into this nice clean slate, and we see it in Kenya. We moved from the post-independence era, one party to multi-partyism. Who knew that in Kenya today we'd be talking about enforced disappearances and extrajudicial killings under the watch of a strong and robust constitution and strong institutions? The work goes on. So what happens in between? And the challenge to all of us is there's fatigue, there's frustration, but we must sustain the momentum, because every single intervention leads us to success of the next intervention. I'll mention 4 of them. Number 1, documentation. The documentation that is being done by both formally established institutions, such as the Commission in South Sudan, the fact-finding mission, together with the journalism, the photography, the advocacy, the stories, keep the issue alive. It's the only thing we have sometimes. But it also preserves the evidence. And so as we speak to the actors who do the documentation, we also speak to the supporters. There's a lot of donor fatigue. In South Sudan now, when you go to the UN, they're like, oh, it's not South Sudan, not again. Can't they get their act together? But I think it's reminding all of us about the significance of documentation, of keeping the issues alive, of keeping the people alive. That is extremely critical. In Kenya, just to share very quickly the build-up in terms of a practical example, documentation that started with the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights in a report titled On the Brink of the Precipice. Documentation done by Kenyans for Peace with Truth and Justice has been the basis of accountability to date. Picha Mtaani by Boniface Mwangi, for instance. We have a record that sustains accountability for the long term. Number 2, and it's been spoken to by the previous eminent speakers, creative and strategic incremental interventions. Baby Pendo, from where we sit, I don't know if Justice Lenaola says it that way, or perhaps prosecution and others, but we see when the ICC failed, when we failed to set up a special tribunal, civil society and victims went to the Constitutional Court. We filed a constitutional petition 122 of 2013. We were going after the state and saying, even if we don't see a criminal on the dock, the government of Kenya has human rights obligations to investigate, to prosecute, to provide reparations. That case has been in the courts, now in appeal for 10th year. We filed on February 2013. Before us, we had expert on reparation, Betty Murungi. Justice Lenaola sat in the case for a good amount of time. I feel sorry that when we end up in the Supreme Court, we may not have you on the bench, but it's been a long journey. And the message is really to say, the outcome in that case, one landmark outcome in that case, was the High Court determined that even though they were not going to give us all the other orders, the state had a duty to investigate and prosecute where police officers were responsible for the violation. Decision, December 10, 2020. When does Baby Pendo get filed? October 2022. You see the build-up. And even now, as Justice Lenaola is urging us, let's think creatively. How do we test this International Crimes Act? Final, the value of strengthening legislative and institutional capacities is extremely critical. Baby Pendo would not have been possible if not for the collaboration between ODPP, IPOA, and partners, some of whom we may not mention, but behind the scenes, even just the appreciation of how do you move from the bludgeoning of a child to creating a case around crimes against humanity that today includes 47 charges against 12 high-ranking police commanders, and includes not just the killing of Baby Pendo, but now includes rape and includes torture. We're not out of the woods. This 12th police commander, who we are told is at large and has gone to Somaliland, we hear frequents Isili and has a cup of tea. The case was filed by a different prosecutor. Today we have a different prosecutor in office who has a different stance and insists that we will not proceed to take plea unless all are in the court. I end by saying we cannot forget about victims. Strengthening victims' networks sustains the momentum. It's very easy for us to sit in a courtroom. The conceptual issues we're arguing about are very critical. How far does command responsibility go? In Kenya now, the question that is before the court is which criminal procedure are you going to apply? It has come up already. One arguing you must use the Rome rules of procedure, and the other saying no. Under Kenyan criminal procedure, you can actually take plea with others not in court. We actually used the Dominic Ongwen case, which one is, sorry, Thomas Koyelo, right? Yes, I get very passionate, remember you said what? So anyway, these are some of the things we've done in the Baby Pendo case. We have set up a victim support working group that is attached to the case. It includes the Kenya National Human Rights Commission and numerous NGOs that are not only offering psychosocial support, but also victim legal representation in the case. It has been extremely helpful to emphasize to the court that there must be a balance between the prosecutor's right and discretion to prosecute and victims' right to a fair and timely access to justice. And therefore, I end by saying, let us cultivate not just civil society coordination and collaboration, but victims' networks, victims' coalitions, victims' movements. The people will sustain the momentum for justice. Thank you so much.